Good morning. So today we're talking about eyewitness forensic science because they are both super important and super problematic, depending on which part of things we're looking at. So by the end of today, you should be able to explain why eyewitness testimony is sometimes problematic and explain what the Innocence Project is and why it's super important to eyewitness testimony. So, first things we have to understand is that eyewitness accounts of crime scenes are often based on things that are independent of the actual crime. So the level of interest someone has in what's going on around them will affect what they remember. If they were under a lot of stress, whether they were concentrating on something, the amount of distractions, uh, that are in the area will affect their ability to be a good eyewitness, their own prejudices. They might bring their own personal beliefs into interpreting what they saw. If they have a motive for being there, that will sometimes affect what they do and don't remember. So if their motive for being in that area was that they were also committing a crime, just a different crime than the one you're investigating, then that's going to affect how good of an eyewitness they can be or what they even remember seeing. Lapse in time since the event, the longer it's been since the event happened, the harder it is for people to remember what happened, right? So, identification studies show that the longer it takes an eyewitness to identify someone in the lineup, the less confident they actually are about that identification. Um, Eyewitnesses who typically take minutes to look at the lineup and then pick out the perpetrator often are feeling pressured to pick somebody. And even if the person that they're like, well, none of them really look like the guy, but this one's the closest, then that means they aren't very confident in that identification. If they're super confident in knowing who it was, they should be able to do it in under 10 seconds. Look at the lineup and go, that's the guy. That's someone who's super confident. That's going to be someone who really got a good look at the person. So, in this country, it is estimated that 85% of people wrongly convicted of a crime, and these would be people who are later cleared by DNA evidence, 85% of them were convicted based pretty much on eyewitness testimony. Somebody said they saw them. So lots of victims of crimes have what are called flashbulb memories. They have a super vivid recollection of a dramatic event. Um, if you talk to people who were alive on September 11th, 2000, and I believe it was 2001, they can tell you exactly where they were, what they were wearing, what was happening on September 11th, because it was a very big emotional thing that it cements everything for that day into their memory. Some other examples might be the election of our first Black president or the day that someone famous died. People often have very vivid memories of that day. That can also be independent. So it might be that it was the day of your 16th birthday and you got a pony or whatever. I don't know. But that might cement that entire day into your memory as a flashbulb memory. So imagine you're at a gas station buying milk. A man walks in, threatens the employee at the counter. The entire ordeal lasts like 5 seconds. It's going to be really hard to identify that person. And the reason might be related to these. So, what makes eyewitness testimony inaccurate? If it's dark, there's poor lighting, they're far away from you, you only see them for 10 seconds. It's really hard to identify someone later from having only seen them for 10 seconds. If they're wearing a mask over their face or a bandana or anything like that, it becomes much harder to identify them. And you've probably experienced this with COVID in that you thought someone looked one way because you only ever saw them with the mask on, and when they took the mask off, you're like, oh my God, that's what you look like? Because your brain had immediately filled in what you thought they looked like under that mask, and they actually look completely different than you thought they did. If you are in a high state of stress or anxiety, that's going to make it harder to remember things. Presence of a weapon will often mess with people's memories because all they remember is the weapon. They don't necessarily remember the person who's holding it. There's also something called own race bias. It is the tendency for people to recognize faces that are similar to theirs much more easily than faces that are very different from their own. And they've proven that this is not a choice that someone makes, it's just how your brain works, that you have an easier time identifying differences when the person's face looks a lot like yours. Um, so memory test, you're going to have 30 seconds to view the next slide and try to memorize all the items on it. You don't get to write anything down until after the screen has been shown. So we're going to wait for 20 seconds. You're going to get to see this, and I'll wait. Okay, so now I want you to write down all of the things you can remember seeing and try and just quickly list them all out really fast. Scratch paper's fine. Just try and list everything you can remember from that previous slide. Now, as you're listing things, I'm going to ask you, how many of you remembered the banana? How many people remembered a pen? How many people remembered a nail? Okay, and so what you're going to figure out is that there was no banana. In fact, no banana, no pen, and no nail. But because I asked you about it, a whole bunch of you probably said, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure there was. I saw something yellow. It must have been a banana since she's asking about a banana. What I did was I implanted a false memory by doing that. And sometimes investigators can do that by accident, like asking someone, well, was the car they were driving blue or black? And you could have sworn it was a gray car. But at this point, you're like, oh, well, it must have been like blue because that's what they're asking you. You automatically get led down an incorrect path by accident. So, questioning an eyewitness, leading question would be, was the man wearing a black jacket? So, the assumption being the person they saw was one, a man, two, wearing a jacket, and three, that that jacket was probably black. So, those would be reasons why that's not a good question for an investigator to ask. Um, it doesn't leave any room for any open-ended answers, and it encourages the eyewitness to confine what they remember. A better question might be, what was the person wearing? Because then it says, okay, it doesn't say this person was male or female. So they could say, well, this person was really tall, but I think it was a woman, or what have you. And it doesn't immediately limit their choices of colors on the jacket or even the presence of a jacket. So when you ask questions of witnesses, you want to be very open-ended. So how can you be a good witness? First off, you see something happen, immediately write down everything you can remember. Why? Because later on, when other people are talking, then it's going to get muddled in your head. So if you wrote it down at the time, it cements it into your memory. Focusing on unchangeable or unique features like a scar or a tattoo or something that can't be changed easily. Things like hair color can be changed, but height is much harder to change. Relate perpetrators to someone you know. So, for example, I might have seen been a witness to an armed robbery, I might look at the person and decide if they were taller or shorter than my husband. So someone I knew, relate them to that and say, oh, well, that person would have been taller than my husband. My husband is 6'2", so that makes them over that height, or makes them under that height, depending. So when you speak to the police, avoid making inferences. If you don't know the answer to their question, just flat out tell them you don't know. So the idea is that if you saw a car speeding away after the fact, that car may not have had anything to do with the crime. And it's not that you shouldn't mention it, it's just that you should say, I saw a car. I don't know if it had anything to do with it. I don't know if that car was involved. I just saw a car driving away quickly. Don't assume the perpetrator is in a lineup if you're put into a lineup. If you're asked to look at a lineup of people, don't assume the bad guy is there because they may not be. So, start at one part of your crime scene as a CSI tech. You're going to start in one place and slowly move your eyes through the crime scene. Look at everything very carefully. When looking at a piece of evidence under the microscope, start on one edge of what you're looking at and move across it so that you get all of the information you can possibly get. Turning off your filters is really hard to do, but try to consciously observe everything and act like a data collecting robot. Just try and see everything. Even if you think it's not important at the time, it might be later. Avoid jumping to conclusions. Try and concentrate on all the information equally and leave interpretation to later. Just because you think that that car was related to the crime doesn't mean it actually is. So avoid jumping to those conclusions, and that will make you a better forensic scientist. So compensate from faulty memories by writing everything down, documenting things, taking pictures if humanly possible. Even verbal testimony of a forensic scientist requires documentation. So if you are collecting evidence at a crime scene, if you did it, you should write it down and take photos of it. Oh, I collected this random weird leaf that didn't appear to belong to any of the trees in the area. Take a photo of it first and collect it. It may prove to be important later. You don't necessarily know. So make sure to really focus on those 4 things to be a good observer. Be systematic, turn off your filters, avoid jumping to conclusions, and try compensating for faulty memories. Now, all of this being said, there is something out there called the Innocence Project. They work to free people who were incorrectly convicted of crimes. And the way they do this primarily is through DNA evidence. So before DNA became a thing, a lot of people were convicted of crimes based on eyewitness testimony. And then later, once they ran DNA, they figured out that this was not the person who committed the crime. So the Innocence Project was founded in 1992. And basically its goal is to get innocent people out of jail and to counteract the faulty eyewitness testimony that may have put people into jail who had not committed crimes. So that's the Innocence Project, and it's important to know that DNA has been very effective in setting people free who did not commit crimes. So there you go. Now you've got all your information that you need about eyewitness testimony.